reason why I raise this is I know that this is hard work, and the general fund is probably the last source we're going to have for this, given all the other needs we have. To what extent, with the waste characterization studies, I know we've done a lot of them in this city, in creeks in particular. Is there any promise in us doing one of those studies, relying on the past study, maybe from our trash capture devices, to be able to identify the source of trash? If there are particularly large fractions coming, say, from fast food outlets or from quickie corner stores, let's imagine there were that category that was clearly a source of 40 or 50% of the trash. Could we consider a fee that would be applied that would represent the concomitant share of the trash that we find in multiple characterization studies?
Yeah, we are characterizing the trash that we pull out of the HDS units or hydrodynamic separator units.
Great.
However, at this point, the data is not clear. By the time we pull it out of there, it's pretty well deteriorated, other than things like plastic bottles, styrofoam.
Right.
There's certain things that stay intact and you can see where they are, but labels, anything paper, it's very difficult to track back. And then even small things, I think you're suggesting perhaps like single-use chipped bags or something. It's that you can tell, but that's hard to locate back, but possibly could be attributed to a convenience store.
Right.
But it's not clear yet with what we have so far.
Right.
But we have more units going in. We just put in, I believe it's 12 in the past year and a half or so. So we'll have more data. But the data to date doesn't clearly show that definitively.
Yeah, I get it.
Yeah.
We'd also add that we're looking at partnerships. So we're looking at revenue, the idea of revenue sources very broadly. So, as the Baykeeper representative indicated, partnering with the Water District, partnering with the Open Space Authority, looking at everyone who's interested in cleaner water and seeing how we can collaborate on projects.
I appreciate that. And, as we think going to our voters, about what it is our voters are actually willing to pay more for, I'm skeptical about the notion that we're going to get 2/3 support for measures that reduce trash in our creeks. I'm not belittling the importance of it. It is important. I'd be surprised if polling suggested that there's strong enough support for that by 2/3 margin. And so, I think about how we could marry this with other priorities that we might have in the city. For example, we know that homeless encampments are a significant source of the challenge. If, for example, there were a measure that focused on how we employ, similar to the downtown streets model, downtown streets team model, or how we employ homeless residents who are living along the creeks, cleaning the creeks they're once living in, being paid a living wage, and cleaning other sensitive areas, and reducing trash that way, and obviously providing a pathway to employment for them. Those kinds of concepts where we are merging purposes, that we will get both a better response and in some ways, be able to spread the benefit beyond the environmental target. Is that something we're testing in the polling that we're doing?
Absolutely. I mean, we certainly recognize the nexus between homeless encampments, bacteria discharges, and impacts to our waterways. In fact, the Water Board recently, or the State Board, I should say, put out a resolution acknowledging that, and they're starting to market that more to the jurisdictions, asking us to coordinate better with our housing and homeless advocates on dealing with that. So that's something we're going to be looking at. I think dealing with the challenge we have today, I think the largest majority of our homeless encampments are along the creeks, so therefore I think what you're inferring is dealing with those encampments along the creeks which have direct discharges. However, when we're talking about green infrastructure projects, generally speaking, they are within the stormwater system, so you're capturing and treating the bacteria or discharge before it gets into the creeks, so before it gets past the outfall.
Right.
So that could be a challenge in there, depending how the program gets designed and how we look at it.
But you're talking about use of stormwater money, is that right?
Correct, yeah.
I was going more at, the polling that
Oh,
you're
sure,
doing.
but yeah.
If you were to have a separate measure.
Correct.
Because again, people may not be all that focused on the trash in creeks, but I'll tell you, they're very focused on the trash they see on the freeway off ramps and on the medians and many of the prominent streets they see. And, I can imagine a program that we might put together that would employ people who were living in creeks to actually clean not just the creeks, but other parts of the city. That could be very broadly embraced by, residents who are really tired of seeing blight, right? And I know, again, not all those dollars are spent on creeks, but it would be a program that may gain far greater acceptance from voters who are paying the bill and perhaps accomplish multiple goals. And so that's why I'm really going at really what we're poll testing, because I think it's really important for us to take a lot of time before we spend the $30,000 to put a poll out there to think about what all those options are. And I'm just wondering, are we testing those kinds of options?
We are, but not as boldly as you suggest. But we'll incorporate that. We're actually pausing on the polling right now, and as we regroup,
Okay.
we'll be sure to include those and elicit some feedback on additional ideas.
Okay, great. Appreciate it, Carrie. Also hoping we can bore down a little more deeply on the Hertzberg legislation. I understand that there were warnings that were given to us, but it seems to me we really ought to understand well what it could enable us to do with stormwater fees. And then, if we're thinking about capital dollars, if this is, for example, bond measure, how you might marry this up with related, though not exactly identical objectives. For example, I think we all want to expand our advanced water purification plant. If a clean water measure were married up with a anti-drought measure, and something that provided us with a safer, more secure drinking supply, I think, again, that is something that would be more embraced by voters if there were capital dollars allocated to both. Anyway, I understand, we're all still thinking about how that would work out, but I'm hoping, again, we can test all these options. Anyway, happy to continue the conversation offline, because we've done some testing in some of these areas, and we have a fairly decent sense about where voters may be very receptive. And so I hope we can talk soon.
No, thank you. Our intent would be to provide a ballot measure as well as actual projects that the community sees value in.
Cool. Thanks, Carrie. Councilmember Khamis.
Thank you, Mayor. And I have to say that I opposed this Baykeeper settlement from day one. I thought it was basically extortion, and I think that this is it was an overly prescriptive plan, and that it's a bad deal for our residents. And obviously, since we're looking at every which way we could tax people with this last discussion, it certainly puts us in a bad position. And I want to be clear, the reason why we're discussing taxes is because it was prescribed in the consent decree on paragraph 55 that requires us to discuss new taxes to raise the $100 million that the settlement prescribed. Many people in our city are having trouble staying in our city because it's so hard to afford, and yet we keep looking at ways to raise fees and new taxes. One of the things that we're recommending here, or that's being recommended, is a parcel tax, and it's a regressive tax. It doesn't matter if you have a small condo or if you have a multi-million-dollar mansion, you're going to pay the same fee. And I have a slide, if you could put that up. Here's a slide that shows, here's a slide that shows a list of taxes that have been levied just in the last year. This is from my own tax bill. In fact, my taxes went up more than 10%. And that's not the normal increase. That's just the increase in new taxes, brand new taxes, not the every year that goes up 2%. So, and everything from school bonds to housing impact, the homeless housing, lots of things are now on this bill. Another solution that's being presented here is the general obligation bond. Well, that's another word for tax, isn't it? General obligation bond is just another way of saying it's an ad valorem tax, and it will impact the same taxpayers that receive one of these things every year. And if we could put up my next slide. The next slide on the sorry, this is what passed on the ballot last year. Anyway, I just want to know what progress we've made on some of the other things that were also in the consent decree to raise the $100 million. They actually spelled out getting grants from Prop 84, Proposition 1 planning grants, and Proposition 1 implementation grants. Those are the three other funding sources that were also prescribed in the settlement. Have we made progress on getting monies from those sources, and if so, how much?
So for Prop 84, we actually did get grants already prior to this consent decree. So we've been in the pipe, if you will, gotten grants and used it for one of our Green Street pilot projects. Prop 84 has been paused, if you will, so no more new grants have been accepted of late, or new applications, because they were so backlogged on all their front-end applications that they're only taking those to date. So they haven't accepted new applications. So haven't gotten much further on them, although, like I mentioned, to date, we've gotten several $100,000 from Prop 84. As far as Prop 1 implementation grants, the city is a member of the Santa Clara Valley Urban Runoff Pollution Prevention Program, which we're a main player in, our main contributor, and we got a planning grant to develop what's called a stormwater resources plan. We're working with the water district on the development of that plan, and we got, I believe it was $460,000 for that, and that plan is a prerequisite to apply for Prop 1 implementation grants. Those have not been posted yet. We expect those to be posted this coming year, 2018. The Prop 1 was a total, I believe it was $7.7 billion, but it included more than just stormwater. It included water, resources, drought-related things as well, too. If I recall correctly, they allocated about $270 million, is what I recall, for stormwater projects, but that's statewide. So once we have our stormwater resources plan completed, which we are on track to do, we can submit that, and we can submit projects. And we already established a list of projects. Public Works and DOT, we worked together to create a list. We submitted that to the Water District to put on the plan and submit it to the Water Board. I think we will be submitting it, I believe it's next month. Yeah.
So I think the project that you were talking about, the first one, is actually in my district. The one that you applied for, yes.
Yes, I believe that's where the Prop 84 grants went
But that
toward.
can't count towards this $100
No,
million.
because it was prior to, that was kind of left the train station before we started this conversation with Baykeeper.
Right. In some of the stuff that the mayor was talking about, these programs that'll help the homeless get off the streets, will that count towards your goals to get to this $100 million? I didn't see it as part of the prescription.
I think it depends on the project. As I said, the intent of the Baykeeper consent decree and the implementation of green infrastructure projects are primarily capital, but I think there are some programmatic things that could be implemented to meet the overall comprehensive load reduction plan. It's a larger plan. It isn't just about capital. It's about reducing bacteria and flow, and therefore a program for homeless encampment, having to deal with homeless, could meet a reduction in bacterial loads. So that it depends. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
When we go to court, it's not about, it depends. It's, it's about what's in the prescription. And it may not qualify, so I can't count it because they can come back and sue us and say, hey, you didn't meet this part of the obligation. We said you need to do X, Y, and Z, and you did A, therefore it doesn't apply, and that's what I'm afraid of. We're this extortion, if it could go on forever. And I don't even know what's new. We're also talking about a park tax. We're talking about other taxes. God knows what the city, the county, and the state's going to do, and we are keeping, complaining about how expensive it is to live in the city. But what I'm really particularly unhappy with is within the lawsuit itself, in the consent decree, we can't even tell taxpayers why we have to go out for this tax. Because on paragraph 57, it says, in any public communications related to fee or tax increases related to this consent decree, San Jose will not negatively cite Baykeeper or this consent decree as a reason for such fee or tax increases, and will allow Baykeeper, to the extent practicable, to review any media or marketing materials in advance of the release to the public. So not only are they telling us to tax our people, they don't want to get any of the credit for being responsible for this new tax being on them, and then they want us to run all the media materials by them. So you understand why I won't be supporting this in any way, whether it comes today or whenever it comes. I will not be supporting any of this effort, and I apologize to my colleagues because I get heated up about this. I just don't like to be blackmailed. Thank you.
Rick, I just wanted to ask, make sure we're clear about what the consent decree mandates or what it doesn't. The consent decree doesn't actually mandate that we tax at all, does it?
No, it can't. You can't contract that power, or you can't by contract say we're going to tax. What it provides is a requirement that over a 10-year period we come up with funding, and various alternatives are listed, including taxes, fees, grants, any and all of those types. The reality in California, however, is there's a limitation on what kind of fees you can impose. There's a limitation on how you can have a special assessment on properties, very strict limitations. And so what we're left with is, if we can't get grants, if we can't come up with other creative schemes, we're really left with taxes. And I think that's why, and I understand Councilmember Khamis's concerns about looking at his tax bill and looking at the number of, most of it look like school parcel taxes. Yeah. But that's the reality is that every governmental entity in California has to seek revenues, and taxes are really the only viable vehicle in most cases. So we're sort of left with that. And so what I think staff has done is come forward and say, okay, here are options. We're going to explore these, and we'll poll and work with folks. And we're working with Baykeeper. And I also want to address the provision about the negative, the media. It's basically, you don't put this in a negative light. It's not to say that we have a legal requirement to meet this, or we have an obligation under the consent decree. We just can't say we're not going to go out there and say in a negative way that this is the result. And it may be a fine point, but I think it's an important point.
If we can just focus, going back to the question, which is, there's no tax mandated by this consent decree, right?
That's correct.
Okay, I just want to clarify that.
Mayor, I didn't say that.
Councilmember Khamis, I'm not finished.
Okay.
When you started, you indicated the consent decree on page 56 mandated a tax. And I want to be very clear, there's no tax mandated by this consent decree. Secondly, I want to be very clear that this is no effort by this nonprofit organization or anybody else to somehow or another bamboozle anyone. There was an alleged failure to comply with the Federal Clean Water Act. That's what was alleged. That was the basis of the lawsuit. That was a law that was passed, I believe, during the Nixon administration that we are required to comply with. And we have an obligation to comply with that.
whether we agree to this consent decree or not, we are still under obligation to comply with federal law around the environmental regulations for clean water. Third, I think it's very important for us to recognize every one of the school bond projects that you listed on the last slide were approved by the voters. In case of school bonds, at least 55% of the voters have to agree to them. Several cases, it was more than 70% of the voters. Voters are quite adept at saying no if they do not want to tax themselves. And that's exactly why we need to have the conversation to understand what is it people are willing to pay for or not. And if they're not willing to pay for it, then we simply don't have a tax and we move on. But I think it is also important to recognize, you know, whatever we say are capital projects or programmatic projects, you know, we could have all the capital projects in the world, but if we still have hundreds of people living along the creek, we're going to have a bacteria problem. And so, you know, I would assume the folks at Baykeeper recognize that, and they're not going to insist on us simply building concrete projects when we know fundamentally what we have is a human problem, which is human beings that are living along a creek that we know create an environmental challenge. And so I expect and hope, and maybe if the gentleman from Baykeeper, you know, would wish to respond, I would expect that Baykeeper would be responsive to our efforts to find a solution that would really address the fundamental issues that are at the core of the alleged violations or the alleged concerns about compliance. And that doesn't necessarily have to simply be capital projects. They, in fact, may be projects that enable homeless individuals to get out of creeks. Did you wish to respond? Yeah.
My pleasure. Thank you for allowing me to respond. Baykeeper is committed to working with the city to accomplish the practical reductions in, as you say, bacteria levels and other pollutants that are getting into the creeks. And if that means reducing homeless encampments, I mean, I think that's a really thorny issue, and it's not an issue that is addressed directly by the Clean Water Act or by the letter of the law, but we recognize that that's where a lot of the pollution is coming from. And if there are solutions that address that, we're as I said, we have a strong relationship with staff, and we're excited about the work we've done so far and about continuing to work with them on all of these issues. And we're open to all of the imaginative and creative solutions that you suggested, which personally I think sounded like good ideas.
All right, thank you, sir. Appreciate it. Councilmember Khamis?
Yeah, Mayor, what I said, and I exactly said it this way because it is exactly stated in the decree. The reason we're talking about new taxes today is because it's required that we have a discussion about new taxes in the decree. And I could prove it to you if you wanted to pull it up, the decree itself, it's on page 55, along with the discussion on other funding sources. So I did not misspeak. I don't want to, I'm usually very thoroughly aware of what I'm saying, and I did not misrepresent in any way. I did not say that they're telling us to do the tax. I'm saying that they told us to discuss the tax by December 31st, to be exact, in their exact words, that we have to discuss this. So I understand that we're fulfilling our the part of the consent decree as specified. And school bonds isn't all that was on. This was on the ballot statement. Yes, most of them were school bonds, but over the last 4 years, we've passed everything, including keeping the bay clean bond, and I don't know, it's on there, it's $24 per household. We do have a keeping the bay clean. We have all kinds of stuff. So it's not, everything adds up. And then when we can't deduct it anymore because of the federal government, it adds up and it hurts a lot more than if we were just to, have it take, I mean, these new taxes by themselves, they hurt, but it's going to hurt a whole lot more when we can't deduct any of them except because of the federal government. So I'm trying to look out for the middle class here. I know people always say that they're looking out for the middle class, but the middle class is the one who's getting beat up left and right by local government, by federal government, and by entities outside of our control. And that's what irks me a little. And I'm not trying to offend staff in any way. I know that they have a challenge ahead of them, and merely wanted to express how, you know, I know we need to do some of these things, but we don't have to be, we didn't have to be told is in a very prescriptive manner, and we didn't have to have a big price tag on our head, basically beating us down to try to get $100 million in our coffers quickly. Anyway, over the next 10 years. So I'm hoping that clarified your concerns, Mayor, and again, I will not be supporting this effort.